There was a kitchen in every Black neighborhood where a grandmother stood on her feet all day, bending, lifting, scrubbing, and never complained about her knees. She had no doctor, no prescription. She had what her mother gave her. Here are 25 reasons why Black women had healthy joints in the 1960s. Every Saturday night in Black households across the South, the bathtub became a pharmacy. Grandmothers dumped 2 or 3 scoops of Epsom salt into water hot enough to make your skin tingle, and they soaked until the water went cold. The salt, magnesium sulfate, though nobody called it that, cost less than 50 cents a box at the 5 and dime, and one box lasted a month. You ran the water as hot as you could stand it, stirred the crystals until they dissolved, and lowered yourself in. The heat hit your knees first, then your hips, then your lower back, and within 20 minutes, the stiffness started to loosen. Women who spent their weeks bending over ironing boards and kneeling on hardwood floors swore that Saturday soak was the only reason they could get up Sunday morning and do it again. Nobody explained the chemistry. The proof was in the way a woman who could barely climb the porch steps on Friday was pressing her Sunday dress by Saturday night. That box of Epsom salt was the cheapest insurance policy in the house. If you grew up in a Black neighborhood in the 1960s, you walked, not for exercise, for survival. You walked to work, walked to church, walked to the grocery store with a metal cart rattling behind you on cracked sidewalks. During the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 and 1956, Black domestic workers walked miles each way to white households rather than ride a segregated bus. And that spirit of walking carried straight through the 60s. In cities like Atlanta, Memphis, and Birmingham, Black women who worked as domestics caught the bus only when they could afford it. The rest of the time, their feet hit pavement before sunrise and did not stop until after dark. That constant low-impact movement kept hips, knees, and ankles lubricated in a way no gym membership could replicate. The soles of their shoes wore thin in weeks, their joints did not. Walking was not a fitness trend. It was the price of living without a car, and it paid dividends nobody expected. Before the world discovered yoga and deep squats, Black women in the 1960s were already doing both on their hands and knees with a brush and a bucket of pine sol. Scrubbing floors was not optional. It happened every week, sometimes twice, and the motion itself was a full joint workout that nobody recognized as exercise. Knees pressed into linoleum or bare wood. Shoulders rolled forward and back with every stroke. Wrists rotated, hips shifted, and the spine curved and straightened hundreds of times in a single session. The burn in your lower back told you the kitchen floor was almost done. The ache in your wrists meant the hallway was next. Domestic workers did this in their own homes after doing it in someone else's house all day. Double the floors, double the movement. The sharp sting of bleach water on chapped hands was just the cost of keeping a clean house. Those women did not have foam rollers or stretching routines. They had a scrub brush, a pair of sore knees, and a floor that needed to shine by morning. But long before any of those floors got scrubbed, somebody had to eat. And in Black kitchens in the 60s, the meal that did the most healing was already simmering on the back burner. Collard greens cooked low and slow with a ham hock or smoked turkey neck produced something more valuable than the greens themselves: pot liquor. That dark, rich broth pooling at the bottom of the pot was liquid medicine, loaded with vitamin K for bone strength, iron for blood, and calcium pulled straight from the greens during hours of simmering. Pot liquor was something grandmothers sipped from a coffee mug like tea. Southern grandmothers had a saying: Pot liquor will cure what ails you, and if nothing ails you, it will give you a good cleaning out. Black families did not waste a drop. They soaked cornbread in it, spooned it over rice, or drank it straight from a mason jar. The greens fed the body. The liquor fed the bones. The smell alone could clear a room. Castor oil, thick, sticky, and impossible to wash off your hands, was the fix for everything that hurt in a black household during the 1960s. Grandmothers warmed it on the stove in a small saucepan, tested the temperature on the back of their wrist, and rubbed it directly into swollen knees, stiff elbows, and aching lower backs. The oil went on warm and heavy, and within minutes you could feel the heat spreading deep under the skin like something alive. Some women wrapped the joint in a hot towel after applying it, trapping the warmth and letting the oil soak in overnight. By morning, the pillowcase was ruined, but the knee could bend again. Castor oil was also mixed with turpentine in some families, a combination that burned going on but worked fast. The bottle lived under the bathroom sink next to the cooking oil, and nobody in the house escaped its reach. If something was stiff, swollen, or sore, castor oil was already on its way before you finished complaining about it. If you grew up in a black household in the 60s and mentioned any kind of joint pain or stiffness, somebody was already reaching for the vinegar. Apple cider vinegar mixed with honey and warm water was the morning tonic that grandmothers forced on everyone old enough to hold a cup. The taste was brutal, sharp, sour, and sweet all at once, and children learned fast not to complain about aching knees around the older women because the cure was worse than the pain. A tablespoon of vinegar, a teaspoon of honey, stirred into warm water and swallowed before breakfast. Every single morning, Dr. D.C. Jarvis published his book, Folk Medicine, in 1958, claiming vinegar could dissolve calcium deposits in joints, and that book circulated through black communities like a church bulletin. The science was debatable. The results were not. Women in their 60s with smooth, easy movement drank that tonic every morning and dared you to tell them it did not work. Open any black grandmother's kitchen cabinet in the 1960s, and you would find a stack of flat tins with pull-tab lids, sardines packed in mustard sauce, sardines in oil, and canned mackerel in brine. These tiny fish were cheaper than almost any other protein on the shelf. They were eaten straight from the can with saltine crackers, on white bread with hot sauce, or mashed into a patty and fried in a cast iron skillet until the edges turned crispy and golden. What nobody talked about was what those little fish were doing inside the body. Sardines are one of the richest natural sources of omega-3 fatty acids, the same compounds that reduce joint inflammation and keep cartilage from breaking down. One small tin delivered more anti-inflammatory power than most modern supplements. Black families ate sardines because they cost 15 cents and filled you up. The women who ate canned fish 2 or 3 times a week moved easier and complained less about stiffness than the ones who did not. The clothesline in the backyard was a full-body stretching routine that nobody called exercise. Every Monday, wash day, in most black households, women hauled wet sheets, towels, and dresses out to the line in a heavy wicker basket, and then they reached. Arms over the head to pin a bed sheet, shoulders rotating to shake out a house dress, the spine twisting to grab the next piece from the basket at their feet, hips shifting to move down the line, and then it all happened in reverse when the clothes came down dry and stiff with sun. The reaching kept shoulder joints mobile. The bending kept hips and knees from locking up. Women who hung laundry several times a week had range of motion in their shoulders that today's generation pays a physical therapist to recover. The sun bleached the sheets, the wind pressed them clean, and that simple motion of reaching and bending kept a woman's body moving right well past 60. If castor oil was the everyday fix, the mustard plaster was what came out when the pain got serious. Grandmothers in the 1960s mixed dry mustard powder with flour and enough warm water to make a thick paste, spread it between 2 pieces of flannel cloth, and pressed that poultice directly against a swollen knee or a locked-up shoulder. The heat came fast, not from the outside but from the mustard itself reacting against the skin, pulling blood to the surface and turning the area underneath red and angry. You could feel the burn building within minutes, and if you left it on too long, the skin would blister. That was not a rumor. It happened, and it happened often. Children learned to sit still and not complain because snatching that plaster off early meant it went right back on tomorrow. The heat drove deep into the joint, loosening everything that cold weather and hard labor had locked in place. Once the cloth came off and the skin was wiped down with a cool rag, the relief hit so fast it felt like a different knee altogether. The sharp smell of turpentine in a black household meant one thing: somebody's body was hurting bad enough to bring out the hard stuff. Grandmothers mixed turpentine with lard or Vaseline and rubbed it directly onto aching joints with bare hands that had built up a tolerance the rest of the family did not have. The burn was immediate. Skin turned red. Eyes watered from the fumes. Children who needed it on their knees screamed like they were being punished. Dr. J. H. McLean's volcanic oil, a turpentine-based liniment sold since the 1800s, sat in black medicine cabinets across the South, its amber bottle right next to the rubbing alcohol. The truth is, turpentine was harsh. It could blister skin, and swallowing it was dangerous. But rubbed on the outside in small doses and cut with fat, it worked as a counter-irritant, flooding the joint with blood and warmth. Grandmothers did not know that word. They just knew the turpentine went on and the pain backed off. Nobody could explain why it worked, and nobody cared. Black grandmothers in the 1960s tied copper pennies around their ankles with string, wore copper bracelets until the metal turned their skin green, and wrapped copper wire around swollen wrists like it was the most natural thing in the world. A folk medicine study from East Tennessee State University found that copper worn on the ankle or wrist was one of the most common arthritis remedies reported by Black women over 65. The green stain the copper left on the skin was not a side effect. It was proof the remedy was working, at least according to the women who wore it. Some kept a copper penny in their shoe. Others threaded one onto a chain and wore it under their dress where nobody could see it. Modern studies have found no real evidence that copper absorbed through the skin does anything measurable for joint pain. But those grandmothers, with their green-tinged wrists, moved through their 70s with an ease that made younger women jealous, and not one of them was interested in hearing what a study had to say about it. The taste hit the back of the throat like something rotten and refused to leave. Cod liver oil, thick, fishy, and yellow, was forced on Black children every winter morning, whether they were sick or not. Mothers lined kids up in the kitchen before school, held out a tablespoon of the stuff, and you either swallowed it or you stood there until you did. There was no third option. The oil came in dark brown bottles that smelled like the ocean had gone bad, and it left a coating on the tongue that no amount of orange juice could wash away. What those mothers knew was that cod liver oil was packed with vitamin D and omega-3 fatty acids, the same compounds that keep joints lubricated and strengthen the cartilage between bones. Children who gagged on that spoon every morning grew into adults whose knees did not crack when they climbed stairs. The mothers were not guessing. They were passing down something their own mothers had given them, and the chain went back further than anyone could remember. If the remedies kept the joints from breaking down, dancing is what kept them loose, and black folks in the 1960s danced like their bodies depended on it. House parties on Friday nights, fish fries in the backyard, juke joints in towns too small for a proper nightclub. The music started and everybody moved. The twist had hips rotating in circles that would make a physical therapist proud. The mashed potato had knees bending and straightening in rhythmic patterns. The boogaloo worked the ankles, the spine, and every joint between them. Nobody was thinking about flexibility. They were thinking about the person across from them and whether James Brown or Sam Cooke was coming on next. But an hour of dancing on a Saturday night worked every major joint through its full range, flooded the body with blood flow, and left you sweating through your good clothes. Black women danced hard, danced often, and woke up Sunday morning sore in the muscles but loose in the joints. In the rural South and in backyard plots from Detroit to Chicago, black women in the 1960s grew what they ate, and the growing itself was half the medicine. Tomatoes, okra, butter beans, sweet potatoes, and greens of every kind came out of soil that women turned by hand with a hoe and their own two knees. The bending was constant. Kneeling between rows to pull weeds, squatting to check a tomato vine, reaching overhead to pick pole beans, twisting to toss a watermelon into a wheelbarrow. Every motion in the garden was a joint exercise disguised as work. The sun beat down hard enough to soak your dress through before noon, and the soil packed under your fingernails no matter how many times you washed. Women who gardened through the growing season kept their hips and knees moving in ways that women behind desks never could. The garden fed the family and it fed the joints, and nobody had to pay a dime for either one. This one sounds made up, but if you grew up in a black household, you already know. When a knee swelled up or an elbow locked stiff, grandmothers reached for a brown paper bag from the grocery store, soaked it in boiled vinegar, and wrapped it around the swollen joint like a bandage. Then they covered the whole thing with a cloth to keep the heat in. The vinegar smell was sharp enough to make your eyes water from across the room, and the wet paper stuck to the skin in a way that felt like wearing a warm, soggy second layer you could not peel off without taking skin with it. Documented in a folk medicine study at East Tennessee State University, the brown bag and vinegar compress was one of the most commonly reported treatments for arthritis among black women in the rural South. Nobody could explain the mechanism. The acidity of the vinegar, the moist heat of the compress, the pressure of the wrapping, or maybe something else entirely that nobody had a name for. It remains one of those remedies that sits in the space between folk wisdom and genuine mystery. All anyone knew was that the bag went on hot, the swelling went down, and the joint moved better by morning. 3 hours every Sunday morning, standing, sitting, kneeling, clapping, swaying, and sometimes catching the Holy Ghost. Not one person in that congregation thought of it as exercise, but black church services in the 1960s put every joint through a workout that most fitness classes cannot match. You stood for the opening hymn, you sat for the scripture reading, you stood again for the choir, you knelt for prayer, you clapped through every up-tempo song until your palms stung. You swayed from side to side during the slow ones. If the spirit hit, you were on your feet with arms raised and your body rocked in a motion that loosened the spine from the neck all the way down. Church was not gentle on the body. The pews were hard wooden benches with no cushion. Older buildings had concrete floors. People kept their heels on for 3 hours straight, but that repeated cycle of sitting, standing, kneeling, and moving kept joints from stiffening in ways that sitting in a recliner never could. And then the commercial started. By the late 1960s, television ads for aspirin, Bufferin, and Anacin flooded living rooms with one message. Your grandmother's remedies were old-fashioned, and a pill could fix it faster. Drug companies convinced black women that the castor oil, the Epsom salt soaks, and the mustard plasters they relied on for generations were backward. And it worked, not the marketing. Women who had rubbed turpentine on their own mother's knees started buying Bayer instead. Daughters laughed at the copper bracelets. Granddaughters threw away the brown paper bags. The remedies did not fail. They were abandoned. And the companies that replaced them made billions selling what a 50-cent box of Epsom salt had been delivering for 100 years. Nobody got rich when grandmothers healed themselves. That was the problem. The marketing worked on the mind, but the body still remembered what it needed, and nothing kept a woman's hands and wrists strong like wringing wet clothes by hand. Before automatic machines became standard in black homes, laundry meant filling a tub, scrubbing fabric against a washboard until your knuckles were raw, and then wringing every piece dry by twisting it with both hands until your forearms burned. The grip strength that came from wringing a soaking wet bed sheet was the kind you cannot build in a gym. Wrists rotated under load, fingers clenched and released hundreds of times in a single wash. Women who did laundry by hand into the 1960s had hands that could open any jar in the kitchen and wrists that never went stiff. The washboard left calluses on the knuckles. The wringing left soreness in the forearms that lasted until the next morning. But the joints in those hands stayed supple and strong in a way that typing on a keyboard will never replicate. A pot of bones simmering on the back of the stove for hours was not leftovers. It was pharmacy. Black women in the 1960s cooked with ham hocks, oxtails, neck bones, and pig feet, not because they wanted to, but because those were the cuts nobody else would buy. The bones simmered in water with onion, garlic, and salt until the broth turned thick and cloudy and the marrow dissolved into the liquid. That broth was collagen in its purest form, the same protein that modern wellness brands now sell in powder tubs for $40 a jar. Collagen holds joints together, cushions the space between bones, and gives tendons their stretch. Every bowl of oxtail soup, every plate of neck bones, and rice was a dose of joint medicine that no one had to prescribe. The bones were cheap, the broth was rich, and the women who drank it kept moving long after the doctors said they should have stopped. You could smell it before you even opened the bedroom door. Bengay, that sharp medicinal blast of menthol and camphor, meant somebody in the house was hurting and had already handled it themselves. The white cream came in a flat tube that lived on the nightstand or inside the medicine cabinet, and black women rubbed it into their knees, shoulders, and lower backs every night like it was part of getting ready for bed. The menthol hit first, cold and sharp, almost electric against the skin. Then the heat crept in underneath, spreading deep into the muscle until the whole area felt like it was glowing from the inside. Icy hot came later with those orange and white tubes that replaced Bengay in some households by the late 60s. The active ingredients were counter-irritants. They confused the nerve endings so the brain stopped registering the original pain. It was not a cure. It was a ceasefire. And for women who spent their days on their feet, that ceasefire was the difference between sleeping through the night and lying awake until dawn. Grandmothers made their own soap, and it was nothing like the soft perfume bars sitting on store shelves today. Lye soap was cooked in a cast iron pot in the backyard, animal fat rendered down and mixed with lye made from wood ash, stirred with a long stick until the mixture thickened and turned the color of wet sand. The lye burned if it touched your skin before the soap cured. Women who made it kept children far from the pot and wore long sleeves even in summer. Once it hardened and aged for a few weeks, that ugly block of soap cleaned everything: clothes, floors, dishes, and bodies. Black women rubbed it on sore joints before bed, and the alkalinity of the lye created a warming sensation on the skin that they swore pulled the ache out. The soap was harsh. It dried out skin if you used too much, and it smelled like tallow and ash. But it penetrated deeper than any store-bought bar, and women who washed with it said their hands and wrists felt looser the next morning. You could not buy that soap anywhere. You had to know someone who made it. Black women in the 1960s did not sit still. Even when they were sitting down, their hands were moving, shelling peas into a bowl, balanced between their knees, snapping green beans with a sharp crack that echoed through the kitchen, threading a needle through a quilt square, peeling peaches for a cobbler, braiding a daughter's hair while watching the evening news. That constant fine motor movement kept every joint in the hand and wrist in working order without a single woman thinking of it as therapy. The repetition was the medicine. Fingers that shelled a bushel of peas on a Saturday afternoon stayed nimble and strong. Wrists that twisted jar lids open and squeezed lemons by hand and wrung out dish rags 10 times a day never locked up the way idle hands do. There was no carpal tunnel in houses where women snapped beans. There was no trigger finger in kitchens where someone was always kneading dough. Grandmothers just called it getting things done. If the busy hands kept the body working, the sassafras tea was what kept the spirit willing. On back porches from Mississippi to the Carolinas, Black women brewed sassafras root into a dark, fragrant tea that tasted like root beer before root beer existed. The roots were dug up from the woods, scrubbed clean, and boiled until the water turned reddish brown and the whole house smelled like earth and sweetness. Grandmothers drank it for what they called bad blood and stiff joints, a spring tonic brewed every year when the weather turned warm. Susie King Taylor, a healer born in 1848, documented sassafras as a blood purifier passed down from her grandmother, and that knowledge traveled through Black families for another century. The tea was later banned by the FDA over concerns about saffron, a compound in the root. But the women who brewed it were not reading FDA reports. They were sitting on porches with their mothers, learning which roots to pull and how long to boil them, passing down a ritual that had more to do with love than chemistry. Some nights, the only medicine was a pair of hands. When everything else failed, like Epsom salt, castor oil, vinegar, and plasters, a mother would sit on the edge of the bed and rub. She rubbed her own mother's knees with oil warmed between her palms. She rubbed her husband's shoulders after a double shift. She rubbed her children's growing legs when they woke up crying in the dark. In some households, the oil was consecrated, blessed by a pastor, and kept in a small bottle on the dresser for exactly this purpose. A study in public health nursing documented that healing touch and anointed oils were among the most commonly practiced home remedies in Black families, passed from mother to daughter without a single written instruction. The pressure of those hands knew where the knots were without being told. The warmth transferred from palm to skin like something that could not be bought. Nobody called it massage therapy. The hands knew what they were doing because someone else's hands had taught them. The kitchen was where the healing happened, not the doctor's office. Most black women in the 1960s could not afford one, and the ones who could were often turned away. So the kitchen became the exam room, the pharmacy, and the recovery ward all at once. The stove heated the castor oil, the cabinet held the Epsom salt. The counter was where the mustard plaster got mixed. The table was where grandmother sat you down, looked you in the eye, and decided what you needed before you finished describing what hurt. Every remedy in this list was born in a kitchen, mixed by hands that never held a medical degree, but knew more about a body in pain than most textbooks will. That knowledge came from watching, from doing, from a grandmother pulling you close and saying, "Hold still, this is going to sting, but you will feel better in the morning." And you did. Some things cannot be replaced by a prescription. If any of this took you back, share it with someone who remembers.